Rain had been falling on Spokane, Washington, since the afternoon shift change. The steady gray kind that the inland Northwest settles into for days in late October. And the fourth-floor windows of Sacred Heart Medical Center held the city's lights smeared and trembling beyond the glass. Sergeant First Class Marcus Reyes had not planned to be at a hospital that night. He had come to return a set of house keys to a woman who hadn't answered her door in 4 days, and a neighbor had told him where she'd been taken. In the corridor, at the end of his leash, Gunner stopped walking. He sat down outside room 412 and would not be moved, which a dog trained to walk through anything does not do without a reason. Through the half-open door was a woman in a hospital bed, small under the blankets, eyes closed, the slow machinery of monitoring keeping its patient count beside her, and no chair pulled close, and no one sitting in it. What Marcus Reyes learned over the next 3 days about who she was, about why no one was in that chair, and about the document a man was carrying in his coat pocket on his way up to the 4th floor, would surface a quiet decision that someone had made about her life, without ever asking her to be awake for it. If this is the kind of story you stay for, subscribe, and stay with me through what happened in that room. Marcus had joined the Marines at 21, the year after his mother died alone in a hospital in El Paso, while he was in boot camp 2 states away. Unreachable for the 11 hours that turned out to be the 11 hours that mattered. He did not talk about this. He carried it the way you carry a thing you can set down for stretches, and then find back in your hands without remembering picking it up. He served 13 years, logistics and convoy security, 2 tours in Iraq, and came home to the Pacific Northwest in 2020 with a back that had filed its complaints and a quiet that had moved into the rooms of his life and made itself comfortable. He did volunteer driving now for a veterans transport program in Spokane County, getting men and women to appointments they could not otherwise reach, which was how he had come to know a woman named Iris Caldwell, whose keys were in his pocket, and who had asked him, the last time he drove her, to check on her if she ever went quiet. He had not understood at the time that she meant it as a request and not a turn of phrase. Gunner was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, black and red, broad through the chest, with a graying muzzle that had come early and a left hip that he favored on cold mornings without ever once complaining about it. He had washed out of a working program for being, in the trainer's exact words, too attached to his handler to focus, which Marcus had decided was not a flaw he needed corrected. Gunner read rooms before Marcus did. When Marcus woke at 3 in the morning with his heart going for no reason he could name, Gunner was already awake, already there, his head coming to rest on the edge of the mattress, the weight of it the one thing that reliably brought the room back to its right size. He did not need to be told when something was wrong. He simply got there first. Iris Caldwell was 79 years old. She had lived in Spokane for 51 years. In a narrow blue house on the lower South Hill, and she had been, for 30 of those years, a labor and delivery nurse at the very hospital she now lay unconscious inside, had caught, by her own careful count, more than 4,000 babies across 3 decades of night shifts, and had been the nurse that other nurses asked for when a delivery went sideways, because Iris Caldwell did not panic, and her hands did not shake. She had a way of talking to frightened young mothers that people remembered for the rest of their lives, and there were grown adults in Spokane who had been told, by their own mothers, that the first hands to ever hold them had belonged to a woman named Iris. Her husband Theodore had died in 2016. They had not had children of their own, a private grief that Iris had folded into her work, so that the 4,000 became, in a way she never said out loud but that everyone who knew her understood, her answer to it. She had a nephew named Garrett, her late sister's son, who lived in Seattle and who had become, after Theodore died, the only family she had left with a legal claim to the word. Garrett visited rarely, He called when there was business to discuss. And in the last 2 years, as Iris's health had begun its slow narrowing, there had been more business to discuss. Because Iris owned the Blue House outright and had a pension from 30 years of nursing and a careful lifetime of savings, and Garrett had become, by a document Iris had signed during a hospitalization 2 years ago, without fully reading it, the holder of her medical power of attorney. She had collapsed at home on a Tuesday. A pulmonary embolism, the chart said, throwing complications, and she had been brought in unconscious and had stayed that way, stable, but not surfacing, for 4 days. The doctors were guarded, but not without hope. The body was fighting. The numbers were holding, and the question of whether Iris Caldwell would wake was, in the careful language of the attending physician, still open. The reason there was no one in the chair beside her bed was the reason Marcus Reyes had been needed and had not known it. Iris had asked him to check on her if she went quiet, because she had understood something about her own situation that she had not had the words to say directly. That the one person with the legal authority to make decisions about her care was a person who stood to inherit everything the moment she stopped needing it. And that this was a kind of arithmetic she did not want to be unconscious and alone inside of. Marcus stood in the doorway of room 412 with Gunnar sitting at his side, and a nurse came down the hall and told him, kindly, that visiting hours had ended at 8, and that he would need to come back in the morning. Marcus looked at the woman in the bed. He looked at the empty chair. "I'll come back in the morning," he said. "And I'll be back tonight too. I'm not leaving her alone in here. Have you ever promised to check on someone, and only understood later that they were asking you to save them? If you've kept a promise like that, or wish you had, tell me about it in the comments." I read every one. The night nurse, whose name was Dolores Ahn and who had worked the 4th floor for 22 years, did not call security, because Dolores Ahn had been a young nurse once on a unit where the senior nurse was a woman named Iris Caldwell, and she recognized the name on the chart. And she recognized something in the way a man and a graying shepherd were refusing to leave an empty room. She brought Marcus a second chair. She told him she'd had to ask, because asking was the rule, but that she was glad he'd said no. And over the long hours of that first night, with Gunnar lying across the threshold of the room where he could see both the bed and the hall, Dolores told Marcus, in the low voice of a hospital at night, what the floor knew. Garrett had been to the hospital twice. Both times he had spoken at length with the attending physician about Iris's prognosis, about quality of life, about what Iris would have wanted, a phrase he used often and with confidence, despite having visited his aunt perhaps 4 times in the previous 6 years. He had asked specific questions about the threshold at which continued intervention became, in his framing, prolonging rather than treating. He had mentioned, more than once, that Iris had been a nurse and would not have wanted to be kept alive by machines, which was a true thing about many nurses, and a thing Garrett had no actual knowledge of regarding Iris, and which the floor had noticed him saying with increasing frequency as Iris's numbers, against his apparent expectation, continued to hold. Gunnar lifted his head from the threshold. Down the hall, the elevator chimed. It was past 11. The footsteps that came down the corridor were unhurried, and they stopped at the nurse's station, and a man's voice asked, pleasantly, whether there had been any change in his aunt's condition. Gunnar's ears came forward. A low sound started in his chest and did not finish. Marcus put a hand on his back. The footsteps did not come to the room, not that night. But Gunnar did not lie back down until the elevator had chimed again and taken them away. On the second day, the document surfaced. Dolores had mentioned, carefully, that Garrett had asked the floor's social worker about the process for executing Iris's advance directive, and Marcus had asked to see whatever directive was on file, and what was on file was a standard form, and what was not on file, but what Marcus learned existed by calling the Veterans Transport Program's office where Iris had once filled out emergency paperwork, was a second document. Iris Caldwell, 18 months earlier, sound of mind and clear of purpose, had drafted a separate directive with an attorney, naming a different decision-maker and stating in plain language her wish for full intervention and her express revocation of the medical power of attorney she had granted Garrett during her hospitalization 2 years prior. She had filed a copy with her attorney. She had not, as far as anyone knew, filed it with the hospital, because she had drafted it expecting to have time, and the embolism had not consulted her schedule. The directive existed. It said what Iris wanted. And the man with the older revoked power of attorney was at the hospital every day, asking how soon a decision could be made. Marcus thought about El Paso, about 11 hours and 2 states, about a chair beside a bed that no one had been sitting in, because he had been in boot camp, learning to be the kind of man who, years later, would not leave a chair like that empty again. He thought about a corporal from his second tour, a man named Davy Lund from Coeur d'Alene, Maine, who had bled out waiting for a medevac that the weather had grounded, and who had asked Marcus, in the time it took, just to stay where he could see him. And Marcus had. And it had not been enough to save him, but it had been enough that Davy had not been alone. And Marcus had learned that night the difference between the help that saves a person and the help that simply refuses to let them be alone, and that the second kind matters even when the first kind fails. He did not leave room 412. The urgency arrived on the second evening when Dolores told him, off the record, that Garrett had scheduled a formal meeting with the attending physician and the hospital's ethics committee for 10 o'clock the following morning to discuss, in his words, the appropriate path forward. The meeting was the mechanism. If the older power of attorney stood unchallenged, Garrett would be the voice the committee deferred to, and the path forward he had been steering toward for 4 days would become the path. Marcus made 2 calls that night from the hallway outside Fort Fall. The first was to Iris's attorney, a woman named Priya Sandoval, whose name he found in the transport program's file, who confirmed in 3 sentences that she held Iris's revised directive, that the revocation was valid and properly executed, and that she could be at Sacred Heart by 9 the next morning with the original document. The second was to a patient advocate the hospital was required to provide and rarely volunteered, a man named Curtis Boyd, who listened and said that if there was a valid revocation, he needed it in front of the committee before that meeting started, and that he would make sure the room knew it was coming. Garrett Caldwell came up to the 4th floor at 9:45 the next morning, ahead of his 10 o'clock meeting. He came in a good coat with a folder under his arm, and the composed, faintly sorrowful expression of a man arriving to do a difficult and necessary thing. He came to room 412 first, perhaps to sit with his aunt for the optics of it before the meeting, and he stopped in the doorway because the room was not empty. Marcus was in the chair beside the bed. Dolores Ahn was changing a line. Priya Sandoval stood by the window with a document folder. Curtis Boyd, the patient advocate, stood near the foot of the bed, and Iris Caldwell lay in the bed where she had lain for 5 days, small under the blankets, the monitors keeping their steady count. Gunnar rose from the floor and placed himself between the doorway and the bed. He did not bark. The growl came from low in his chest, continuous, and his graying head was level, and his eyes were on Garrett, and they did not move. When Garrett took a step into the room, Gunnar took a step forward, and Garrett stopped in the doorway, his folder held against his chest. Garrett recovered. He looked at the room with the mild confusion of a man who had expected to be the only person in it, and then he assembled himself and spoke. He said he was Iris's nephew and her medical power of attorney. He said he appreciated everyone's concern, but that these were family decisions. He said his aunt had spent 30 years as a nurse and would never have wanted to be kept alive like this, that he was only trying to honor what she would have wanted, that the meeting at 10 would settle the appropriate course, and he would ask that the room be cleared so he could have a moment with her first. The room was quiet. Priya Sandoval's hand moved toward her folder, and Curtis Boyd drew breath to speak, and the machinery beside the bed kept its count. And then, from the bed, in a voice like dry paper, barely above the sound of the rain on the glass, Iris Caldwell said, "I told them I wanted to live." 6 words. Her eyes were open. They had opened sometime in the last minute, while the room was full of people deciding things over her, and they were fixed on her nephew with the flat, clear lucidity of a woman who had spent 30 years awake on night shifts and had just woken into the most important one of her life. She was not confused. She was not the woman Garrett had been describing to the physician for 5 days. She was Iris Caldwell, and she had heard him, and she had answered. The folders slipped in Garrett's hands. His face did the thing a face does when a story it has been telling is contradicted by the one person who was never supposed to speak again. Marcus stood. When he spoke, it was quietly, the way he had learned to speak in places where the volume of a voice mattered less than the steadiness of it. He said that there was a valid, more recent directive, that Iris Caldwell had revoked the power of attorney 18 months ago, in writing, with an attorney, and it stated her wish for full intervention, and that the attorney was standing in the room with the original document. He said the meeting at 10 could still happen, but that it would be a different meeting than the one Garrett had scheduled, because the patient had a voice now, and a valid directive, and a room full of witnesses who had heard her use both. He did not accuse Garrett of anything. He said what was true and let the truth occupy the room. Priya Sandoval handed the directive to Curtis Boyd. Curtis Boyd read the first page and looked up and said the 10 o'clock meeting would need to be reframed and that the hospital would be proceeding on the basis of the patient's documented wishes and now her stated ones. Garrett looked at his aunt. Iris looked back at him, awake, and said nothing more, because she had already said the only thing that needed saying. He left. Gunnar watched him to the elevator and did not lie down until the doors had closed. Iris Caldwell recovered slowly over the following 3 weeks, and then less slowly, and the body that had caught 4,000 babies turned out to have a good deal of fight left in it. The revoked power of attorney was formally voided. The advance directive she had drafted with Priya Sandoval was entered into her record as the controlling document. The questions that the floor had quietly raised about Garrett's conduct passed into channels that did not need Marcus to follow them, and his standing in the family arithmetic was not what it had been. None of it was Iris's concern by then. She had a house on the lower South Hill to get back to, and she intended to. Dolores Ahn, it turned out, had been one of the young nurses Iris trained in 1991, and she sat with Iris on her breaks for the rest of the stay, and the two of them talked about deliveries from 30 years back, the way old soldiers talk about old campaigns. Marcus drove Iris home the day she was discharged, because the Veterans Transport Program did not strictly cover her, and he did it anyway. Gunnar rode in the back, and at the narrow blue house, Iris had Marcus carry in a chair from the porch and set it by the front window where the afternoon light came in, and she sat in it, and Gunnar lay down across her feet as though he had been doing it for years, and Iris put her hand on his graying head and said he was a good dog, and meant something larger than the dog. There are people who spend their whole lives being the one in the chair beside the bed, the steady hands, the calm voice, the one who stays when staying is the job. And there is a particular cruelty in leaving such a person to wake alone in a room where someone has been quietly deciding they should not wake at all. Iris Caldwell woke up. She woke into a room with a Marine in the chair, and a shepherd at the door, and an attorney by the window, and she said the truest 6 words she had ever needed to say. And they were heard. Marcus Reyes had come to return a set of keys. He had the same Tuesday night as anyone else. Gunnar sat down outside a door and would not move. So he stayed. He kept the chair. This story is for everyone who has spent a life caring for others and feared, quietly, that no one would be in the chair when their own turn came. Someone will be. And for anyone who has ever kept a vigil that mattered, refused to leave a room, refused to let a person be alone in the dark, you already know what the chair is for. Is there an Iris in your life? Someone who cared for everyone else and might need someone to sit in the chair now? Tell me about them in the comments. I read every one. Let's fill this section with names that deserve someone in the chair. Every story on this channel is about keeping the chair. If that means something to you, subscribe, so you're here for the next one. There are more stories to tell. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.